Has anyone ever told you that you were the problem, just to avoid blame?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? The day they told me there was no money for my education, a brand new truck rolled into our driveway with a bow on it for my brother. I remember standing there with the acceptance letter in my hand, the first big accomplishment I had that could have changed everything for me, and hearing my parents say with straight faces that they were just too broke to contribute a single dime. They gave me this long speech about how times were tough, how college was my dream and not something they could take on, and how I should be grateful they raised me to be independent. I sat quietly, nodded, and bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. A week later, I opened social media and saw Tyler smiling next to the shiny new truck they had proudly bought him, captioned with, "Our boy deserves the best." That was the moment when something in me snapped, but instead of exploding, I went silent. I could have screamed, I could have begged, but I realized begging them was pointless. If they wanted to help, they would have found a way. Instead, they made it clear who mattered more. So I made a decision. I would not ask them again, not for gas money, not for rent, not for books. If I had to eat instant noodles for 4 years straight, so be it, but I would not hand them the satisfaction of watching me crawl back. I opened my laptop, stayed up all night, and filled out every scholarship form I could find. I wrote essays until my fingers hurt, poured my frustration into paragraphs about resilience and drive, and clicked submit on more applications than I could count. Every rejection stung, but every acceptance felt like another small victory that was mine alone. I also learned a trick no one tells you about. At the financial aid office, a woman named Mrs. Patel sat me down, listened to my story without rolling her eyes, and explained that universities have a process for students whose parents refuse to contribute while claiming to be broke. She told me to keep every scrap of proof, every text, every email where my parents said no. She explained how professional judgment works, how an administrator can override a dependent status if you show evidence of estrangement or neglect. I walked out of that office clutching a checklist like it was a lifeline. That night, I opened my email and sent my parents one message. "I just want to confirm that you are not able to contribute financially to my college expenses. Please reply so I have this in writing." My mom answered within the hour, "We love you, but we simply cannot. You're on your own." I stared at that line for a long time before saving the email in 3 different folders. The next week, they offered me a small compromise. If I wanted to commute from home, they would give me some gas money, but only if I agreed not to move into campus housing. That was their way of controlling me, of keeping me under their roof while pretending they were helping. I typed out a polite response thanking them for the offer, then clearly stating that I would be handling my own housing and finances. I attached the acceptance letter from the scholarship I had just won. No arguments, no tears, just one neat message that left no room for negotiation. For the first time, I felt a strange kind of power. Still, the truck photo burned in my mind. I remember scrolling through the comments, family friends gushing about how proud my parents must be, relatives congratulating Tyler, people writing things like, "Well deserved." I wanted to scream the truth, that they said they were broke, that they told me I was on my own, that my dreams were somehow disposable while his new wheels were a priority. But I didn't write a single comment. I didn't like or react. I just saved the photo and quietly filed it next to the email from my mom. Evidence. Proof. Receipts. In the silence, I started planning. I changed my phone number and only gave the new one to a few trusted people. I set up my college email as my main contact. I made Jasmine, my future roommate, my emergency contact instead of my parents. It was not a dramatic declaration. It was paperwork, quiet, and simple. I realized then that silence and documentation could be sharper than shouting. Every time I wanted to pick a fight, I opened another scholarship application instead. Every time I wanted to post about the unfairness, I filed another form with the aid office. It was not glamorous, but it was effective. When classes finally started, I moved into campus housing with nothing but 2 suitcases and a small box of books. My parents texted that they wished I had stayed home, that I was making life harder for myself, but I did not answer. Instead, I sat on the bare dorm bed, opened my laptop, and pulled up the file folder I had labeled Proof. Inside were their messages, their refusals, and the photo of the truck. I looked at it one last time and then shut the laptop. That was the day I promised myself that I would stop asking for space at their table and build my own. And yet, I knew this story was not finished. Because the truck was not just a truck. It was a symbol, a reminder of the choice they made, and the evidence I would carry with me for years. I had no idea then exactly how I would use it, but I knew the day would come. That day arrived sooner than I expected. A letter slid under my dorm door with one line that made me catch my breath. Your appeal has been approved. The aide officer had signed off on my independent status, which meant more scholarships, more grants, and fewer strings. I stared at the paper and laughed out loud. It was official. I no longer needed them. And from that moment on, I understood that silence was not weakness. It was my weapon. I didn't tell them about the approval. I didn't update them about my classes. I let them think I was struggling, maybe even failing, because I wanted them comfortable in their assumptions. Meanwhile, I was quietly setting the stage for the future. And when I saw another photo of Tyler standing next to his truck with the caption, First Road Trip, I smiled to myself and whispered, enjoy it, because one day I'll be driving past you and you won't even know where I'm headed. Only a few people know this trick, but here it is. Silence combined with paperwork beats drama every single time, and I learned that lesson faster than I ever expected. Once the approval came through, officially marking me as financially independent, I realized how much freedom those forms gave me. It was not just about getting more aid, though that alone kept me afloat. It was about the fact that my parents could no longer call the university pretending to speak on my behalf, no longer demand information about my grades or my account, and no longer interfere in my life in ways I did not consent to. The school, by law, was required to tell them nothing, and that shift in power felt like the ground tilting in my favor for the first time. I knew I could not afford to relax, though, because surviving without a safety net meant keeping a careful balance. I got a job at the library circulation desk, where the pay was modest but steady, and I signed up to tutor high school students in the evenings through a campus program. Some nights I dragged myself back to the dorm so tired that I fell asleep with my laptop still open on the desk, but every paycheck gave me proof that I could manage, however barely. I kept track of every deposit, every expense, and every bill in a folder on my computer labeled Control, because that was what I craved most: control over my life, my time, and my choices. There were moments, of course, when the silence from home crept under my skin and made me wonder if I was making a mistake. Tyler would send the occasional text bragging about the upgrades he made to the truck, the road trips he took, the freedom he enjoyed with no bills hanging over his head, and sometimes I wanted to scream at him that he had no idea how good he had it. Instead, I would close the message, breathe, and remind myself that resentment would not pay tuition, but discipline and planning would. I chose not to reply, not out of cruelty, but because I knew engaging would only drain the little energy I had. What surprised me was how quickly other people stepped into the roles my parents had abandoned. Jasmine, my roommate, noticed when I skipped meals to stretch my food budget and started splitting groceries with me, insisting that she would cover milk and eggs if I covered pasta and rice. Professor Reed, who taught my first-year writing seminar, asked me to stay after class one day and gently said that my essays carried more weight than most students because they sounded lived in, and when I explained a little of my situation, he nodded and told me to use it as fuel, not baggage. He became the kind of mentor who answered my emails at midnight when I panicked about internships and even introduced me to people in his professional network. The more support I found outside my family, the more I realized that blood ties did not automatically equal loyalty. That realization hurt, but it also freed me. I stopped measuring my worth by what my parents withheld and started measuring it by what I could secure for myself. Every time I walked into the financial aid office and saw Mrs. Patel's approving smile as she checked my file, I felt grounded in the knowledge that I was not powerless. Of course, my parents still tried to tug at the strings when it suited them. One afternoon during my sophomore year, I got an email from my mom asking for a copy of my class schedule because she and Dad were thinking of visiting. It was written as though nothing had happened, as though they had been cheering me on the whole time, and for a moment I sat staring at the screen, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Then I remembered the privacy flag I had placed on my records, which meant they could not get my schedule even if they called the registrar, and the thought made me smile. Instead of replying, I deleted the email and went back to studying. That small act of deletion became a kind of ritual for me. Every unwanted message they sent went into a folder I named Proof, alongside the original refusal to help and the truck photos. I never responded, never explained, never argued. I just collected. By junior year, the folder had grown thick with screenshots and attachments, a silent archive of every choice they made, every boundary they tried to cross, and every excuse they gave. I knew one day it might come in handy, though I had no idea exactly how. The more distance I created, the more my parents leaned on their favorite narrative that I was ungrateful. A cousin mentioned at Thanksgiving that my mom had been telling everyone I was too proud to accept their help and that they had tried everything to keep me close. I wanted to correct her, to lay out the truth, but I bit my tongue. Let them spread their version, I thought, because in the end, facts would matter more than rumors. I had the receipts, and when the time came, I would not need to raise my voice. By the time I reached the halfway point of college, I had built a life where my parents' influence no longer dictated my every move. I paid my bills, balanced 2 jobs, and maintained grades that kept my scholarships intact. I was exhausted most of the time, but it was the kind of exhaustion that comes with building something real. There were nights when Jasmine and I laughed ourselves hoarse over cheap takeout, and afternoons when Professor Reed would scribble publishable in the margin of my essays, and in those moments, I felt stronger than I ever had under my parents' roof. The silence I had chosen was not empty after all. It was full of intention, full of strategy, and full of quiet victories that no one could take away from me. And even as I held tight to my independence, I could sense the tension building, like a storm waiting on the horizon. Because for all the freedom I had carved out, my parents were still out there, telling their version of the story, and I knew it was only a matter of time before those two realities collided. The first sign came in the form of an envelope slipped under my dorm room door, not from the aid office this time, but from the administration, notifying me of a departmental award I had been nominated for. It was a small recognition, but it came with a ceremony, and the moment I saw the date circled in red, I realized exactly how fragile the wall I had built might be. My parents had ignored me for years, but the second my achievements became public, they would not be able to resist stepping back into the picture. And so, once again, I started preparing, not with anger, not with outbursts, but with documents, boundaries, and silence sharp enough to cut. Because if they were going to come looking for me, I would make sure they found exactly what I wanted them to see, and nothing more. 99% of people skip this step, keeping every single piece of proof, every receipt, every email, every message, because in the moment it feels petty or obsessive, yet I knew instinctively that it would one day serve as the backbone of my story. The evidence that my version of events was not just my perception, but a record carved in black and white. By the time I reached my junior year, the folder labeled Proof on my laptop had become heavier than I realized, filled with documents that mapped out a silent timeline of abandonment, favoritism, and my own survival, and every time I opened it, I felt less like a victim and more like someone quietly writing the closing arguments of a case she was determined to win. The daily grind of independence was brutal, and there were nights when exhaustion felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. Yet, even in those low moments, I reminded myself that every hour I spent shelving books at the library or tutoring students in math problems was another brick in the wall of stability I was building. I worked shifts that blurred into one another, grabbed meals at odd hours, and studied long past midnight, but I never let my grades slip because I knew one lost scholarship could send the whole structure tumbling. Some classmates talked about their weekend trips home where their parents stocked their fridges, slipped them gas cards, and offered to pay their phone bills. And I smiled politely while thinking about how my parents had funneled that same energy into buying Tyler a vehicle that probably cost more than my entire yearly tuition. Tyler remained a background presence in my life, occasionally texting in a tone that wavered between bragging and cluelessness. And although part of me wanted to snap and remind him that my life was built on scraping together pennies while he enjoyed road trips and upgrades, I forced myself to step back and see him as what he really was, not the enemy, not the mastermind, but the golden child chosen to be the excuse for their hypocrisy. When he once sent me a message asking if I could help him write a paper for a general education course, I told him I would walk him through how to structure it, but that I would not write it for him. His reply was half a joke, half a complaint about how unfair I was being, and I could almost hear my parents' voices behind his words, reinforcing the idea that his time was too valuable to be wasted on work. I kept that text too. Meanwhile, my parents crafted a narrative online that made me want to throw my laptop across the room. They began posting about being so proud of their family, about the sacrifices they made as a one-income household, about how they raised both kids with values of independence, and about how they believed in letting us find our own way. Relatives liked and shared those posts, some even leaving comments about how inspiring my parents were, and I had to clench my fists to stop myself from typing out a rebuttal. Instead, I took screenshots. When one post included a photo of Tyler's truck with the caption, "Proof that hard work pays off," I saved that too, labeling it with the date. I did not argue with them publicly, because I knew that would only turn into another story about how ungrateful I was, but I stored every piece of hypocrisy in that folder, knowing the day would come when the contrast between their words and their actions would matter. The more I invested in silence and documentation, the more confident I became in setting boundaries that once would have terrified me. When my mom emailed me asking if I would send photos from campus so she could include me in a family holiday card, I drafted a response that was short, polite, and final. "Please remove me from family posts unless you ask for my consent." I attached a formal notice I had found in a student rights document about privacy, signed it, and sent it. Her reply was defensive, full of lines about how family should be above such things, how I was being cold, how she was only trying to show she cared, but to me it was just another piece of evidence. I saved her response, closed the folder, and went back to writing my midterm paper. That semester, I learned something that changed the way I thought about my own silence. Professor Reed, who had become both mentor and ally, told me during office hours that withholding information was not the same as lying. That sometimes controlling who had access to your life was the only way to protect yourself from being rewritten in someone else's story. He said it with such quiet certainty that I carried it with me like a mantra. I began to think of my silence not as avoidance, but as authorship. Every choice not to reply, every boundary I drew in writing, every document I filed became part of a narrative I owned completely. Still, I would be lying if I said the weight did not press on me. There were nights when Jasmine found me staring at my laptop screen, scrolling through old emails from my parents, and she would gently close the lid and hand me a bowl of noodles, telling me I deserved to eat something before collapsing into bed. She knew more than anyone else how much I was holding inside, and sometimes she would remind me that building a case against your own parents takes a toll, even if it feels necessary. Her words helped, but they also made me realize that the path I had chosen was not just about surviving college, it was about preparing for a confrontation I could feel creeping closer with every achievement I added to my record. The first real clash of narratives came at a family gathering I did not attend, where, according to a cousin, my mom told everyone that I had cut them off because I was too proud to accept help. That lie spread faster than the truth ever could, and I spent a week debating whether to correct it. In the end, I did not. Instead, I saved screenshots of the social media posts where relatives praised my parents for being patient with me, screenshots that now sat alongside the email where they flatly told me I was on my own. The folder grew thicker, more damning, and I realized that I was building not only a safety net for myself, but also a kind of weapon, one I did not intend to use recklessly, but one I knew could cut through every polished lie if the moment demanded it. By the time junior year ended, I had carved out a fragile but functional independence that no one could take from me. I had savings, scholarships, and a network of mentors who believed in me more than my parents ever had. Yet beneath the surface, tension buzzed like static because I knew that my parents' version of the story was spreading unchecked, painting me as the difficult daughter who refused love, while I quietly stacked evidence to show the truth. It was a standoff of narratives, and I was determined to let them feel safe in their illusion until the day it shattered. That day was not far off. Because when I opened my inbox one morning to find an official notice that I had been selected for a prestigious departmental honor, complete with a public ceremony, I felt a chill run through me. Recognition meant visibility, and visibility meant my parents would hear, whether I invited them or not. For the first time, I realized that the folder on my laptop was not just a record. It was preparation for the showdown that was about to arrive, whether I was ready or not. Here is what happens behind closed doors when you control the guest list and the timeline with the precision of a surgeon who has spent years studying where to cut and where to leave the scar untouched for maximum effect. The story finally belongs to you. And the people who once believed they could walk in late and claim ownership arrive to find that every door they used to access is locked, every shortcut they counted on is blocked, and every seat that might have given them a view has already been taken by the ones who actually showed up when it mattered. The email from the department landed in my inbox on a gray morning that I barely noticed because I was racing between a shift at the library and a tutoring session, yet the subject line stopped me cold with its formal phrasing that felt like a drum roll. And as I read that I had been selected for a senior honor that included a small ceremony and a line in the commencement program, I felt the slow burn of vindication mix with a very practical checklist spinning to life in my head. I closed my door, opened the folder where I kept templates for boundaries and requests, and drafted 3 messages with care that bordered on obsession. One to the registrar to confirm my directory restriction and reaffirm that no information could be released without my consent. One to the commencement office to verify how many tickets I would receive and whether names could be added to the pronunciation cards that speakers sometimes use, and one to the department coordinator asking whether awardees could designate guests by name, because I intended to be meticulous about who stood beside me in any official capacity. When the answers came back, I moved like a person who had been training for this moment for years without saying the words out loud. I submitted the pronunciation card with a line that included my full name and a note that, should the ceremony give me a chance to thank anyone briefly, I would thank Mrs. Patel from Financial Aid, Professor Reed from the department, and Jasmine, my roommate and family of choice, and I did this not to be petty, but to ensure that the only names attached to my success in that room were the ones that deserved the weight and the applause. I sent the guest list with those 3 names, locked the tickets the second the portal opened, and set my commencement profile to private so that nothing could appear online before I wanted it to. I did not post, I did not hint, and I did not tell my parents, because their absence during the years of work had already spoken louder than any congratulatory text ever could, and I had no interest in inviting a last-minute rewrite. Of course, the scent of recognition carries further than silence, and it did not take long for a cousin to relay the news to my mother, who texted me with a tone that tried to wrap itself in warmth while still smelling of entitlement, asking what time she and my father should arrive and where they should pick up their tickets. I stared at the message long enough to feel the old ache press against my ribs, then opened a new draft that was clean and neutral and unarguable, pasting the public information page for graduation that anyone could access and adding a single line that the university manages all seating, and I had already designated my guests, which was true and complete and did not require an apology. She replied with a paragraph about family, about how parents deserve to see their child walk, about how they had always believed in me even when I pushed them away, and as I read those words I remembered the original email in which they told me I was on my own. The truck photo that followed like a punchline, and the way I had taught myself to breathe through anger by converting it into forms and files and timelines. I did not answer. The weeks leading up to the ceremony were a blur of exams, work shifts, and quiet logistics that felt like tightening a series of small screws until the structure stopped wobbling. I met with the department coordinator to confirm the run of show and learned that the award ceremony would be intimate, held the day before the larger commencement, which meant separate tickets, separate seating, and another clean opportunity to place my people in the front row where I could see their faces when my name was called. I told Jasmine to wear whatever made her comfortable and free to cry without feeling embarrassed. I asked Mrs. Patel if she would allow me to introduce her to my mentor afterward so I could thank them together. And I wrote a short acknowledgement for the podium that was plain and unsentimental but carried the full truth of what I wanted to say, which was that some of us arrive at the finish line carrying our own water, and the ones who handed us cups along the route deserve the medal as much as we do. On the morning of rehearsal, my phone lit up with another message from my mother, this time sharper and less careful, accusing me of trying to humiliate them, warning me that family talk spreads fast, and threatening to show up and make a scene if I did not provide the tickets she believed were rightfully theirs. I read it once, felt that old heat rise, and then did what I had done since the first day I chose silence as strategy. I moved the message into the proof folder without a single word in reply. I forwarded a copy of my privacy note to the venue coordinator with a polite request for security to direct any unlisted visitors to the public seating. And I returned to rehearsal where the announcer practiced my name and smiled when I offered the card with the 3 people I would thank. The ceremony itself arrived like a storm that I had tracked for months with careful weather maps, and when I walked into the hall and saw Jasmine already in her seat, Mrs. Patel smoothing the edge of her program, and Professor Reed waving with the soft pride of someone who had watched a student grow into her own, I felt a steadiness settle into my bones that no text, no rumor, and no last-minute demand could shake. I gave my short remarks, I named the people who had stood in the gap, and I watched the applause roll toward them like a tide that was finally moving in the right direction. Afterward, while we hugged in the corner, my phone buzzed on repeat with calls from numbers I recognized and chose not to answer, and when I checked later, there were voicemails that swung wildly between guilt and anger, each one insisting on a version of the past that never happened. That night, I sat at my desk and prepared a folder that I had imagined 100 times yet never assembled until this exact moment, a folder that contained the original emails in which my parents refused support, the screenshots of their public posts praising themselves for sacrifices they never made, the time-stamped truck photo that followed their claim of poverty, and the official aid letter that confirmed why I was able to stand on that stage without owing them a single thing. I did not prepare it to punish, but to anchor the truth in something heavier than memory, and I slid the folder into my bag with the calm of someone who has already decided how the final conversation will go. In the morning, commencement would draw a crowd large enough to drown out almost anything, and my parents would have to come early to secure a seat in the general section because they had no tickets bearing their names, and if they wanted to speak to me, they would have to wait until I chose the time and the place, which would be public and neutral and quiet enough for every word to land where it belonged, and as I turned off the light, one thought settled in with such clarity that I fell asleep smiling despite the storm outside, because for the first time in years the next move was entirely mine, and they had no idea what I was about to place on the table. Can you guess what happened next? Because the morning of commencement unfolded like a plan I had built one careful line at a time, and when I stepped onto the campus green with my gown zipped and my cap pinned, I could already feel the hum of a crowd that had no idea it was about to witness the quiet end of a long argument, which made me breathe deeper, stand taller, and move with the certainty of someone who has finally accepted that control is not loud. It is precise. The arena filled in waves that looked like tides if you watched them from the tunnel, families spilling into rows with programs clutched like souvenirs, and somewhere above the sea of faces I knew my parents were scanning seat maps on their phones, asking volunteers for preferred sections they would not be given, and calling numbers that would ring against the inside of my bag without being answered, because the system I had set up years earlier had been designed for this exact hour, a machine that ran on policies, lists, and the very simple fact that access is not a right when it has never been earned. I found my row, pressed my palms once against the folder inside my tote as if to confirm that paper is heavier when it carries the weight of a choice, and when the procession music swallowed the whispers and the dean began reading names, I felt the kind of relief that comes from making peace with the path you chose even when it was built from nights of doubt and mornings of work, because there is a steadiness in knowing that you did not cheat, you did not bargain, you did not trade your dignity for an easier route, and if anyone wanted to debate that, they could talk to the stack of forms that kept me alive when love was rationed. When my name moved from the card in the marshal's hand to the microphone and the sound rose, I walked that short stretch of carpet that had once felt like a mountain in my mind, shook the dean's hand, accepted a diploma case that smelled faintly of ink and new binding, and turned to the audience in a small pivot that let me locate the faces I had written into the ceremony on purpose, the people sitting exactly where I had placed them, who had paid in time and care and patience, and as the applause softened, I used the single breath they allowed for words to thank Mrs. Patel, Professor Reed, and Jasmine, which landed like a bell that keeps ringing after the air has gone still. I did not scan the general seating to search for my mother's expression or my father's posture, because the story did not belong to them in that moment, and once the recessional carried us back down the aisle and into the light, I guided my small group to the meeting point I had chosen the night before, a quiet edge of the plaza near a low wall where photos would be easy and exits even easier, and there we took the picture I had waited 4 years to take, one where I stood between the people who never asked for credit yet deserved it more than anyone else, and when Jasmine nudged me to check my phone, I typed a caption that said only that everything had been paid in full and that I was grateful for the ones who believed when believing cost time and effort. Then I pressed post and let the image carry the rest. They found me minutes later with faces already tightened by a story that had stopped working the second the announcer read my thanks aloud, my mother stepping forward with a smile that flickered at the edges, as if she could not decide whether to perform pride or anger. My father staying half a step behind like a man waiting to see which way the wind would turn, and Tyler lingering off to one side, confused by a script that no longer made sense, and I let them approach without moving toward them. Because space is part of power when you have spent years without any. My mother began the speech I expected, a string of lines about misunderstandings and how families sometimes drift and how they only wanted to be included and how they had been telling everyone how proud they were. And I let her talk until the words ran out and the part where she usually demanded credit came into view, at which point I lifted the folder out of my bag and offered it to her with the calm you borrow from a courtroom, explaining that inside she would find their initial email confirming they would not contribute to my education, a copy of the truck purchase post dated the very next week, the professional judgment letter that approved my aid because of their refusal, and printouts of the social media posts where they praised themselves for sacrifices they did not make, and that I was giving it to them not to embarrass, but to end the debate over who had done what. Silence is strange when it finally shows up in a family that has used noise to win every disagreement, and in that breathless pocket my father reached for the folder with hands that shook a little. Tyler shifted his weight like someone discovering the floor had changed under him, and my mother said the sentence I had anticipated since the day I moved into the dorm with 2 suitcases, which was that people would think they had abandoned me. To which I replied that people would read the words. They wrote and draw their own conclusions without my help, because I had promised myself I would never again serve as their translator when the record was already perfectly clear. I offered them a boundary with teeth, not a threat and not a door slammed in their faces, but a conditional path that felt fair to me even if it felt harsh to them, telling them that if they wanted to be part of my life moving forward, they could begin by correcting the public record they had created, by removing the posts that used my name without consent, by sending a single message to the relatives they had misled that clarified I had funded my education through aid and work, and by understanding that tickets, phone numbers, and holidays are privileges earned through consistency rather than sentimental claims the week of a milestone, and that if they chose not to do any of that, I would accept the choice and continue exactly as I had for the past 4 years. Tyler spoke then in a voice that sounded younger than he wanted it to, asking whether there was anything he could do that did not involve him being dragged into the middle of our parents' mess, and, because I had prepared for that question, I told him there were 2 simple things he could start with, the first being to return the framed family photo he took from my room the day I left, which had always felt like a small theft dressed as nostalgia, and the second being to call me when he had a plan for his life that belonged to him rather than to anyone's expectations, because I would help him think it through if he wanted that kind of help, and if not, I would step aside and let him drive the truck wherever he pleased. There were no tears, no raised voices, no scene that a stranger could have filmed for a feed, only the slow recognition that my rules were not temporary and that the system I had built would not crumble the first time someone pushed on it. And when my mother tried once more to pull the conversation toward forgiveness without accountability, I lifted my hand in a gesture that made her stop, thanked them both for meeting me, and told them I needed to rejoin the people who had seats because they had earned them long before today. Then I turned and walked back to Jasmine and Mrs. Patel and Professor Reed, who were waiting with the kind of patience that comes from knowing you are watching someone close a door without slamming it. On the walk to the photo line, my phone buzzed with comments on the post from relatives who now understood the shape of the truth without me naming anyone or twisting a knife, and I felt an unclenching inside my chest that I had not trusted myself to imagine. A release that was not victory over another person but victory over the part of me that once believed I needed their approval to be complete, and as the sun slid across the plaza and the band fumbled into a cheerful song, I realized I had done exactly what I set out to do years ago in a dorm room with one lamp and a stack of forms, which was to end the story on my terms, with a move so clean and simple that it looked like it had always been the only ending available, even though I knew how hard I had fought to write it. They drifted away eventually, the crowd swallowed them the way crowds do, and I stood between the three people I had thanked by name while the photographer counted down in a voice that made everyone smile because it was trying so hard to be official. And when the shutter clicked, the sound felt like a seal pressing into wax, a confirmation that the final act had been signed, witnessed, and archived, and that whatever came next would not be a return to the old pattern, but the start of a life where my boundaries were not defenses built in panic, but the architecture of a home I had earned, room by room, word by word, choice by choice.